Victor Langford III was not defined by the billions attached to his name, but by the crushing boredom that seemed to ooze from his every pore. He treated the world as a stage built solely for his amusement, and the men and women who crossed his path were merely players in an endless performance in which he alone directed the script. On a Tuesday evening wrapped in velvet and candlelight, he selected his next unwilling actor in the heart of New York's most exclusive restaurant, the Gilded Swan. Her name was Aria Johnson, and in his eyes she was a nobody, a servant whose existence barely registered outside the tray she balanced and the uniform she wore. The Gilded Swan was no ordinary dining hall. It was the sanctum of titans, a cathedral of power disguised as a restaurant, where fortunes greater than the GDP of small countries shifted hands over lobster tail and vintage Bordeaux. The air carried the scent of aged wood, money perfume, and the hushed reverence of those who believed themselves the arbiters of destiny. A misplaced word or faltering step within those walls could cost a career. The staff lived on a knife's edge of composure, and no one knew this balancing act better than Aria. For 40 hours each week, she became invisible. She moved silently in her crisp black uniform, her face set into the polished neutrality of a mask. Her arms never trembled as she carried crystal glasses worth more than her monthly rent. She could describe seared sea bass with saffron foam with a poet's conviction, even though her last meal had been a cup of instant noodles. She was a ghost to the guests, a figure to fill their glasses and remove their plates, an anonymous presence fading into the plush background of velvet curtains and hushed laughter. But Victor Langford's cold blue eyes settled on her that night, and his mind conjured a little game. To him, humiliation was a kind of theater, and he had grown tired of the same tired acts. He wanted something novel, something to spark amusement in the faces of his entourage, sycophants who laughed a little too loudly and leaned in too eagerly. He wanted a show, and Aria was the chosen performer. Victor arrived at the Gilded Swan as he always did, draped in arrogance and tailored silk, a man who dismantled companies as a pastime and devoured reputations like hors d'oeuvres. He carried a retinue of business partners, socialites, and would-be disciples, all eager to bask in his reflected power. They filled Table 7, the restaurant's prime vantage point, overlooking the manicured garden, and soon their voices swelled louder than the room, a chorus of artificial mirth surrounding their patron saint of cruelty. Aria had been assigned to his section, a twist of fate that made her stomach knot. From the corner of her eye, she caught the glance of her colleague Ben Carter, an actor moonlighting as a waiter, who whispered with a wry smile as she passed by, "Act 3, Scene 1. Enter the dragon." His words were meant as humor, but to Aria they were prophecy. Victor snapped his fingers to summon her, as if she were not a woman, but a bellhop. He sneered at the menu, sent back a $600 bottle of wine with disdain, and began to pontificate loudly to his table about the failures of modern society. He gestured in Aria's direction with a breadstick, as if she were an object on display. "You see, the problem with this country," he announced, "is people without ambition, content to serve, satisfied with mediocrity." His companions laughed on cue. Tightened, but she gave no sign of offense. She had long ago mastered the art of dissociation. He was not speaking to her. He was addressing the uniform, the ghost she became to survive the endless gauntlet of slights. Yet something in his tone, in the deliberate cruelty of it, pressed against a wound she kept buried beneath layers of silence. The night dragged on, each hour weighted by the steady climb of humiliation. Victor's laughter was a grating instrument, his gestures sharp with entitlement. He spoke of mergers like gladiatorial combat, of bankruptcies like hunting trophies. Around them, New York's elite tried not to stare, but could not ignore the spectacle. No one ever challenged Victor Langford. He was a predator among them, and predators were left to feed. Aria continued her rounds, her movements precise and professional, though her chest felt constricted beneath the starched fabric of her blouse. Each time she approached Table 7, she felt like prey edging closer to the lion's den, and each time she withdrew, she sensed the inevitable. A storm was brewing in Victor's restless gaze, a new cruelty forming like a thundercloud behind his pale eyes. Near at the center of the restaurant stood a magnificent Fazioli grand piano, polished to a mirror shine, gleaming beneath the chandelier light. It had been placed there not for service, but for spectacle, played only on rare occasions by professionals hired for special events. That night it sat silent, a dark sentinel amid the velvet splendor. Victor's gaze drifted toward it, then back to Aria as she cleared the table. A cruel smile crept across his lips. The stage had been set, though the actors had not yet been told. Aria balanced the plates in her hands, unaware that she would no longer be invisible in the next few moments. She would be thrust into a theater not her choosing, forced to perform for an audience of predators and gods of finance, an unwilling gladiator stepping into the arena. And Victor Langford, hungry for spectacle, was already savoring the taste of her humiliation. For most of the world, Aria Johnson was a shadow. She rose before dawn to catch the subway from her cramped Bronx apartment, slipped into the pressed black uniform that transformed her into anonymity, and stepped into the glittering world of the Gilded Swan, where wealth hung as heavy as the crystal chandeliers. There she disappeared. Guests barely registered her presence, except in the instant a wineglass emptied or a plate vanished. Her role was to erase herself while maintaining perfect precision. She had perfected the art of invisibility. The sway of her body as she threaded through crowded aisles with a heavy tray of glassware was graceful, almost balletic. Her smile was polite, never too wide, never too cold. She spoke the specials of the evening with conviction, describing saffron foams and rare truffles as if she had savored them herself, though the truth was her last meal had been a bowl of instant noodles eaten standing at her kitchen counter. Every gesture was practiced, every movement designed to keep her alive in an environment where one mistake could end her job. The Gilded Swan was not just a restaurant, it was a crucible. Servers who faltered under pressure did not last a month. A misplaced fork, a spilled glass, a tone too sharp with a guest could erase weeks of flawless work. Managers drilled them like soldiers. The mantra was simple: perfection or disappearance. And so Aria became perfection. Her colleagues noticed, but said little. They admired how she balanced 6 plates without a tremor and navigated through rooms thick with perfume and ego. Ben Carter, ever the dramatist, told her once that she was the best ghost he had ever seen. Aria smiled faintly, because he was right. She had built a life of careful silence, where the world forgot her as long as she did her job. But behind that mask lived a storm. Her small, rent-controlled apartment still held the remnants of her abandoned life. In the corner, covered in a dusty white sheet, was the old upright piano her father had cherished. Her mother refused to sell it, telling her it was his pride and her destiny. For years, Aria avoided it, the sight of the instrument stabbing at her like an accusation. She had been a prodigy, mastering Liszt at 9, composing original works at 16. Juilliard had given her a scholarship. Her professor, Dr. Aldridge, declared her one of the rare talents who appeared once in a generation. Then Miles had died, her younger brother, her anchor, her first audience. The boy sitting beside the piano for hours listening, telling her she made the keys speak. The boy who had inspired her unfinished concerto, Miles' flight. One drunk driver had stolen him from the world, and with him had gone her music. She had left Juilliard within a week, unable to hear the sound of a piano without tasting grief. The Gilded Swan became her refuge and her prison. There, her grief was hidden beneath the clink of glasses and the rustle of menus. The paycheck kept the lights on and covered her mother's medication. Each day she promised herself she would endure, and each night she returned home to a silent apartment, never lifting the white sheet that entombed her past. To the guests she served, she was nothing more than a server with steady hands and a pleasant voice. To the managers, she was dependable. To Ben, she was a fellow actor trapped in a different role. To herself, she was a hollowed-out musician walking through life like an echo. As she slipped between tables, she could feel the tension in the air even before Victor Langford raised his glass. The Gilded Swan was mighty, which made the air thick and the staff cautious. Titans of finance, socialites draped in jewels, critics, heirs, and moguls filled the dining room. Every plate she set down felt like a performance on a tightrope. Every smile, a mask stretched thin. She was accustomed to invisibility, yet she felt eyes on her more than once. Perhaps it was her own nerves. It could be the shifting mood of the evening. But as she moved through the candlelit labyrinth of tables, she sensed that her ghosthood would not hold. Something was about to fracture the careful silence she had built around herself. She did not yet know that Victor Langford's boredom was sharpening into cruelty, or that the silent piano gleaming at the heart of the restaurant would soon demand her voice. For now, she carried plates, bowed her head, and clung to the fragile safety of being unseen. In another life, Aria Johnson had not been invisible. She had been incandescent. Her childhood was filled with the resonance of piano keys, the sound of ivory and ebony striking together to create magic that startled even seasoned teachers. By 9 years old, she played Liszt with the precision and emotion that stunned recital halls. By 16, she was performing and composing, building elaborate sound tapestries that carried fire and fragility. Her compositions spoke of joy braided with sorrow, of stories too deep for words. Her professor at Juilliard, the formidable Dr. Aldridge, once told her after a performance that she was a once-in-a-generation voice, the kind of artist critics spent lifetimes waiting to discover. Juilliard had rewarded her brilliance with a full scholarship. The practice rooms became her sanctuaries, where her fingers bled from endless hours at the keys. But her soul soared. She was not simply good, she was breathtaking. And at the heart of it all was her younger brother Miles. Miles was her constant companion, her audience, her fiercest supporter. He was younger, but never bored, never restless when she practiced. He would lean against the side of the piano, his head resting on the polished wood, eyes wide with admiration. "You are not just playing notes, Aria," he would say softly. "You are telling stories. You make the piano talk." For him, she played with abandon. She wrote her masterpiece. It was called Miles' Flight, a composition filled with climbing arpeggios and bright melodies that mirrored his spirit, quick and restless and full of unspent energy. On the night tragedy came, she had been working on the final measures of Miles' Flight. She polished transitions, ensuring every note soared as he did when he laughed. Then the phone rang. A drunk driver had run a red light. Miles had been on his way home from his part-time job. In an instant, her brother was gone. The world collapsed. Juilliard's halls, once sacred, became unbearable prisons of memory. The piano keys turned into accusations beneath her fingers. Every chord reminded her of Miles' absence, of his laughter that would never again echo against the walls of their apartment. She lasted 1 more week before she abandoned her scholarship. The music that had defined her life was suddenly unplayable. The grief hollowed her out, leaving silence where symphonies had lived. Her mother tried to console her, but grief swallowed them both. The upright piano in their Bronx apartment was covered with a white sheet, a shroud draped over an instrument that had once been alive with sound. Her mother refused to sell it, saying it was her father's pride, her daughter's destiny, and a memory too sacred to discard. To Aria, it became a tombstone. She could not look at it without feeling the weight of failure and guilt. She had promised Miles that she would finish the piece for him and carry him into the future through her music. Instead, she buried her talent alongside him. Years passed, with her avoiding the instrument, avoiding the echoes of who she had been. She learned to survive instead. Jobs came and went, until she landed at the Gilded Swan, where the pay was just enough to keep the bills covered and her mother's medication supplied. She traded in her place on the stage for the anonymity of a waitress's uniform. Where once she drew gasps of awe, she now served plates with mechanical precision. She became a ghost, haunting the dining rooms of the rich. Yet the music never truly left her. At night, when exhaustion dragged her down, she dreamed of melodies. Fragments of Miles' flight would steal back into her mind, delicate phrases weaving themselves into her sleep. Sometimes she woke with tears, hearing his voice urging her to play again. But she would silence it. The pain was too raw, the promise too broken. Better to remain a ghost than to reopen wounds that would never heal. Knee still, she felt the ache every time she walked past the piano at the center of the Gilded Swan. Its polished surface gleamed beneath the chandeliers, a mocking reminder of the world she had forsaken. She forced herself never to look too long or let her gaze linger on the keys. But deep within her, beneath the uniform and the mask of neutrality, the prodigy still lived. Broken? Yes. Buried? Yes. But not extinguished. The ghosts of her genius and her brother's faith in her waited. The evening grew louder around table 7 as Victor Langford basked in the glow of his entourage. The Gilded Swan's other patrons sent discreet glances in his direction, but none dared interfere. Victor thrived on such attention. He sipped his wine with a predator's ease, his eyes roaming the room as if everything within it existed for his entertainment. Then his gaze stopped on the polished Fazioli grand piano at the center of the dining hall. A cruel idea bloomed across his face like a stain. Aria Johnson was clearing dessert plates when she felt his stare pin her in place. She kept her expression carefully neutral, but her chest tightened. Victor leaned back in his chair, his smile spreading, and then in a voice loud enough to command the entire restaurant, he declared that he had a brilliant idea. The room fell into a hush, the anticipatory silence that always preceded one of his infamous spectacles. He pointed directly at Aria with a finger heavy with jeweled rings. "You, waitress, play us a tune." The word struck her like a slap. The plates in her hands suddenly weighed 100 pounds. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him, but the laughter from his companions confirmed otherwise. The woman beside him with a diamond necklace large enough to pay Aria's rent for years pulled out her phone to record the scene, smirking at the promise of entertainment. Aria found her voice, quiet but steady, saying she did not play. The lie was instinctive, a shield she had polished for years. Victor laughed, the sound harsh and sharp, like glass breaking. "Of course you do," he sneered. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, perhaps. Do not be shy." He pulled out a wad of bills and peeled one free, holding it out like bait. "Here, for your trouble, $100 to humiliate herself." The restaurant manager, Mr. Harris, rushed over, his face pale but determined. "Mr. Langford insisted that our staff are not here for your entertainment. Miss Johnson is one of our finest employees." Victor did not even turn to face him. "Harris said lazily that your restaurant is in a building my corporation owns. I am considering raising your rent when your lease is up. Are you sure you want to insist?" The threat hung in the air, cold and suffocating. Mr. Harris faltered. He looked at Aria with helpless apology before stepping back, neutered by the weight of power he could not oppose. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with anticipation. Every eye in the restaurant fixed on Aria. Some looked at her with pity, others with amusement, most with indifference. She was a spectacle now, stripped of invisibility. Victor leaned forward, his grin wide. "Go on," he said. "Play. Or are you too good to entertain us?" His companions chuckled, emboldened by his cruelty. Aria stood frozen, the humiliation scorching through her body. The piano glistened in the candlelight, a black coffin containing everything she had buried. She wanted to run, to flee into the night and never look back. But she thought of her mother, the bills piled on the kitchen counter and the eviction notice that might follow if Harris lost his lease because she defied a man like Victor. Catapult. And then, through the panic, another image surfaced. Miles, sitting cross-legged on the floor by the piano, his eyes shining wonderfully as he whispered that she made the piano talk. The memory flared like a spark, catching fire inside her chest. Anger began to burn, hot and defiant. Victor wanted a joke. He wanted to see her stumble. He wanted to brand her dignity with his money clip. Very well, she thought. He would get his spectacles. Her face remained a mask, but a long fire dormant within her eyes awoke. Slowly, she set the plates down on a nearby station, each movement deliberate. She lifted her head and locked her gaze onto Victor's, holding his eyes without flinching. The table grew quiet at her audacity. Without a word, she turned toward the piano. The walk stretched before her like a mile of plush carpet. Every step was a trial. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stairs pressing into her back. She was no longer invisible. She was prey walking into the lion's den, yet also something more, something rising from the ashes of her silence. Victor leaned back in satisfaction, convinced the humiliation was complete, unaware that he had just set the stage for his undoing. The distance between the serving station and the piano was no more than 20 yards, yet to Aria Johnson it felt like a pilgrimage across an endless desert. Each step sank heavily into the carpet, muffled and slow. But in the Gilded Swan's charged silence, every breath she took seemed to thunder in her ears. Plates and silverware clinked faintly in the background, but no one spoke. Diners leaned forward, eyes gleaming with voyeuristic curiosity. Some looked at her with pity, others with hungry anticipation, and still others with the cold detachment of spectators awaiting a gladiator's fate. Victor Langford sat back in his chair like a Roman emperor presiding over his arena. His smug smile gleamed in the low candlelight. He had orchestrated the humiliation perfectly. A servant was dragged into the center of the room and coerced into playing before an audience of the wealthy and powerful. In his mind, the outcome was already inevitable. He expected clumsy hands and broken chords, the sweet nectar of failure to feed his boredom. His entourage whispered and chuckled, eager for the performance of degradation to begin. Aria's hands trembled, but her steps remained steady. She focused on the piano that loomed ahead, polished to a mirror finish beneath the chandeliers. It looked less like an instrument and more like a coffin, gleaming black, the burial site of her music, Miles, and her soul. She had avoided the sight of keys for 4 years, avoiding the unbearable reminder of what she had lost. Now she was walking toward it, drawn not by choice but coercion, yet compelled by something else. Phantom instinct was to run. She could have dropped the plates, stormed out the front door, and vanished into New York that night. But running would have meant Harris losing his lease, her mother losing her medications, herself losing the fragile stability she had clung to. Escape was not survival. So she walked, though her body screamed to flee. And then the fire that had sparked in her chest moments earlier flared brighter. She saw Miles again, not lying broken on a highway, but alive, laughing, eyes full of wonder as he pressed his ear against the wood of their piano. She heard his voice. "You make the piano talk." The memory burned away her fear. Anger replaced it, raw and defiant. This was no longer only humiliation. It was an arena where she could reclaim what had been stolen from her, if only for a moment. Victor wanted a spectacle. She would give him one, but it would not be the spectacle he imagined. Her steps slowed as she neared the piano, not from hesitation, but from deliberation. She allowed the silence to build, let the diners lean closer, and allowed Victor's anticipation to sharpen. She ran her hand over the glossy wood as she reached it, her fingers grazing the cool surface. It was like touching a memory, both painful and tender. She pulled out the bench and lowered herself onto it with the grace of a queen ascending a throne, not a waitress bowing to orders. The air in the Gilded Swan seemed to be still. Even the clinking from the kitchen stopped, as if the staff themselves were holding their breath. Aria adjusted her posture, shoulders back, head high. For the first time in years, she faced the 88 keys, her battlefield, her sanctuary, her home. Pajan handled deeply, filling her lungs with the expensive, suffocating air of the restaurant, and exhaled slowly, releasing not just the breath, but the years of silence and grief that had shackled her. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling not from weakness, but from the enormity of what was about to happen. Stabilized, her victor smirked, his hand lazily swirling a glass of Bordeaux. He was ready for the joke, ready to crown himself the clever puppeteer of the evening's entertainment. But Aria was no puppet. She closed her eyes, saw Miles's face again, and let the fire in her chest guide her fingers downward. Rope about to fall, with it the walls of her silence. In that suspended second, before sound broke the air, she was no longer a ghost or servant. She was the prodigy reborn, the artist rising, the sister speaking for her lost brother. The stage that Victor thought he had seized was no longer his. It was hers, and the next moment would determine her dignity and the very balance of power in the room. The silence that blanketed the Gilded Swan was almost holy. Every candle seemed to burn more brightly. Every crystal glass seemed to hold its breath. Aria Johnson sat at the gleaming fazioli, her back straight, her hands poised above the keys. For years, she had avoided this position, the distance between her palms and ivory, a chasm she dared not cross. Now she hovered there, suspended between the ghost of her promise never to play again and the fire of defiance Victor Langford had awakened. The first note came softly, a single F-sharp that floated into the air like a child's tear. It was almost an apology, hesitant, fragile, so quiet that for an instant the diners thought they might have imagined it. Victor smirked, confident his expectation of failure was about to be satisfied. His companions leaned forward, ready to sneer and laugh at the waitress fumbling through nursery rhymes. Then came a second note, then a third. Slowly, like a whisper gathering courage, a melody began to form. It was not Twinkle Twinkle or Chopsticks. It was something else entirely, something mournful yet deliberate. The line of sound threaded through the silence, delicate but sure, the voice of sorrow contained for too long. The atmosphere shifted. Confusion flickered in Victor's eyes. His smirk wavered. Aria's body changed with the music. Gone was the bowed head of a servant. Her shoulders pulled back, her spine straightened. Her fingers stopped trembling and moved with a certainty that seemed impossible for someone who had denied her art for so long. Each note she touched released another fragment of the grief she had caged within her chest. The melody deepened, harmonies slipping beneath like shadows, weaving a fabric of loss so rich it made the air heavy. Across the room, forks froze midway to mouths, conversations dissolved, servers stood still, trays suspended. The music demanded attention. It was not background decoration for expensive meals. It was not entertainment for a bored billionaire. It was a confession, a reckoning, a plea. Victor frowned, lips. He had orchestrated humiliation, but now found himself caught in the current of something he did not understand. This was not a display of weakness. This was power. And for the first time in the evening, the control of the room slipped from his hands. The melody swelled. Aria's left hand built a low, rolling arpeggio, thunder rumbling at the horizon. Her right hand climbed higher, notes straining upward like cries hurled into an uncaring void. It was the sound of grief transforming into fury. The storm that had lived inside her since the night of Miles's death now tore free. The piano, neglected and silent for so long, roared to life under her command. The diners felt it. Their eyes widened, their hearts quickened. The woman with the diamond necklace lowered her phone, the smirk wiped from her face. Some guests felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of their eyes. Others sat rigid, overwhelmed, as if the music had reached inside and found secrets they had not spoken aloud. Aria was no longer in the Gilded Swan. She was back in her Bronx apartment, Miles beside her, his head resting against the piano, his voice whispering encouragement. She poured her agony into the keys, the unbearable loss, the silence that had nearly destroyed her, the promise broken. Every ounce of herself bled into the notes. Victor shifted in his chair. The predator's ease was gone, and in its place sat a man unsettled, stripped of certainty. The spectacle he had crafted was turning against him. He had meant to make her small. Instead, she was growing, filling the room with vast sounds that swallowed his arrogance. The melody thundered and wailed, a tempest unleashed, yet within its chaos was precision, a discipline carved from years of practice. This was not random noise, it was mastery. Genius had been buried and was now reborn under the worst of circumstances. The music surged toward its first peak, Aria's face transformed. Tears shimmered on her cheeks, but her expression was no longer one of humiliation. It was fierce, unflinching, radiant. She was not apologizing for her pain, she was wielding it as a weapon. The room was spellbound, and though no one dared to speak, though no one dared to move, every soul present felt the shift. The balance of power had begun to tilt. The billionaire at table 7 was no longer the master of the evening. The waitress at the piano was.
The quiet lament that had begun with fragility transformed before the eyes of the audience into something vast and uncontainable. Aria Johnson's fingers no longer hovered with caution, they flew. The left hand surged downward in waves of arpeggios, rolling and relentless, the sound of thunder gathering strength across a dark horizon. The right hand cut through with sharp cries of anguish, notes reaching higher, faster, until they seemed to tear at the air. Aided its collective breath, it was no longer a restaurant. It had become a concert hall, a cathedral, an arena of revelation.
The guests leaned forward, transfixed, their meals abandoned, their wine glasses forgotten. The performance was not polished entertainment. It was raw, dangerous, alive. The storm of a soul broke open after 4 years of silence. Aria's body seemed consumed by the music. Her shoulders rocked with the power of her strikes. Her chest rose and fell with the urgency of her breath. Tears coursed down her face, but did not slow her. She was fury made flesh, grief transformed into flame. Every phrase hammered at the walls she had built around her heart. Every crescendo pushed her further from invisibility and deeper into truth. Victor Langford's smug grin had long since dissolved. He stared, glass slack in his hand, as if reality had shifted beneath him. He had sought laughter and received a hurricane. He had commanded a servant and awakened a master. The joke had curdled in his throat, leaving only disbelief. His entourage, once eager to jeer, now sat frozen, their eyes darting between him and the woman at the piano, as if realizing they had been dragged into a reversal ritual. The storm inside the music told a story no words could capture. It was the slam of doors, the shatter of glass, the scream of a girl who had lost her brother to senseless chance. It was her nights of silence, her mornings of grief, her years of pretending she had no music left inside her. The notes thundered and crashed, demanding witness, demanding that the world remember what she had buried. Yet beneath the chaos there was control. Each shift in tempo, each cascade of chords carried the unmistakable mark of genius, honed through years of discipline. This was not wild flailing, it was mastery, a storm conducted by hands that had once been trained for greatness. The diners could feel it, the critics in the room, the musicians who dined there in anonymity. They knew what they were hearing was not chance. It was destiny clawing its way back to life. The woman with the diamond necklace lowered her phone completely. She could no longer film. Her eyes were wet and her hand trembled. Across the room, conversations had ceased entirely. Even the waitstaff stood motionless, tears slipping down a few cheeks as they witnessed the impossible transformation of their colleague. Aria's mind was not in the restaurant. She was back with Miles. She felt his presence as clearly as the keys beneath her fingers. His laughter rang in her ears, his words urging her forward. "You make the piano talk." And she did. She made it scream, she made it rage, she made it cry for everything stolen from them both. She gave him a voice again on her own. The storm swelled to a terrible height. Her hands blurred with speed, chords colliding like waves against a cliff. The sound filled every inch of the Gilded Swan until it seemed the chandeliers might shatter. Diners clutched at their tables, not in fear, but in awe, as though a force of nature had been unleashed in their midst. And then, as suddenly as it had risen, the storm began to shift. The fury gave way to aching beauty. The left hand slowed, rolling into gentler arpeggios, while the right hand softened into a melody that trembled with memory. The storm did not vanish, it transformed. It was no longer destruction, but mourning, no longer rage, but remembrance. Aria's tears fell freely now. her body trembling as the music carried her into its next chapter. The audience leaned forward, still caught in the aftermath of the hurricane, their hearts pounding, their throats tight. They instinctively knew they had witnessed something rare that could never be replicated. The storm had passed, but the echoes of its fury lingered. The air itself seemed different, charged, alive. And at the center of it all sat Aria Johnson, no longer a ghost or servant, but an artist reborn in fire. When the storm subsided, the room did not dare exhale. Aria Johnson's hands slowed but did not falter, moving with a tenderness that felt like a hand stroking the edge of a fading photograph. The notes emerged soft and deliberate, fragile threads weaving together a familiar melody that pierced her chest even as it spilled into the silence. It was Miles' Flight, the piece she had once written for her brother when the world was still filled with his laughter. The right hand carried the melody upward, bright and soaring, the sound of a boy running freely beneath an endless sky. The left hand supported it gently, offering roots beneath the wings. The music did not feel like an accusation for the first time in years. It felt like a reunion. Each phrase carried the echo of Miles's voice, urging her onward. "You make the piano talk." The piano spoke now in his language, memory and light. Tears blurred her vision, but her body knew what to do. The old patterns carved into her muscles resurfaced as if no time had passed. She played not for the room, Victor Langford, or the glittering crowd of elites, but for the boy who had sat beside her with eyes wide in wonder. She played for the promise broken, now remade, for the love that still bound them. The diners who had felt the violence of her storm moments ago now felt something different. The music reached the deepest places of their hearts, places they had locked away beneath layers of ambition, cynicism, and wealth. Some felt the faces of their own lost loved ones shimmer at the edge of the melody. Some thought of childhoods long gone, of voices silenced by time. The woman with the diamond necklace lowered her head, mascara streaking her cheeks. A man in a dark tailored suit pressed his hand to his mouth, struggling to contain sobs. Aria's world narrowed to the keys and to the memory of Miles. The white sheet draped over the piano in her Bronx apartment dissolved in her mind, revealing the upright instrument and her brother's head resting on its side. The years of silence fell away. She was back in that apartment, his laughter blending with the music. The pain did not vanish, but it transformed into something she could bear and even cherish. The melody swelled, no longer mournful but luminous. It was love, distilled into sound, pure and radiant. It filled the vaulted room of the Gilded Swan until every guest was wrapped in it, bathed in its warmth. The chandeliers glowed brighter, the shadows seemed softer. The piano was not a coffin now, but a beacon. Victor Langford sat stricken. He had intended to break her. Instead, he found himself broken, his arrogance dwarfed by the immensity of her gift. He looked around, but saw no allies. His companions had forgotten him, their faces wet with tears, their gazes fixed entirely on Aria. For the first time in years, he was irrelevant. At a corner table, an older man deliberately set down his fork. His hair was white, his suit immaculate, his presence commanding, though he made no effort to draw attention. His name was Gabriel Duval, a legendary conductor and critic and the National Symphony Hall Committee chairman. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in concentration, listening as if his soul depended on it. He did not recognize the piece, and that shocked him. He knew every work in the canon, but this was something new, something personal, something transcendent. Aria's playing grew quieter, the melody thinning to a single line, delicate and trembling. It was the sound of memory itself, fragile yet eternal. She closed her eyes and let her tears flow freely, baptizing the ivory keys. This was her confession, farewell, and love letter to the boy who had been her first believer. Every note carried his name, every chord carried his flight. And then, slowly, she let the piece rise. The sorrow gave way to a calm strength, each phrase more resolute than the last. It was acceptance, not despair. It was a promise that his memory would live, not in silence but in song. The melody soared one final time, reaching for the light, and then descended into a chord of peace. The sound lingered in the air long after her hands fell still. The silence that followed was not emptiness but fullness, as if the room had absorbed her memory and held it sacred. 200 people sat transfixed, their breaths caught, their hearts bare. In that moment, the Gilded Swan was no longer a temple of wealth and vanity. It was a sanctuary consecrated by the music of memory, the love of a sister for her brother, and the rebirth of a soul through sound. The final note of Miles' flight trembled in the air like a bird suspended on a gust of wind. Aria Johnson held it until the resonance faded into stillness, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, her body bowed as if praying. The room was frozen. 200 of New York's most potent and jaded souls sat in stunned silence, their jeweled hands motionless, their lips parted, their breath caught between disbelief and reverence. It was as if time had stopped to honor what they had just heard. Aria's tears fell onto the ivory, leaving dark spots shimmering in the candlelight. She was empty, hollowed out, yet that emptiness felt clean for the first time in years. 4 years of grief, guilt, and silence had poured out of her in the span of minutes, and now she sat in the quiet aftermath, trembling with exhaustion, but also with release. Her chest rose and fell in shallow waves, each breath fragile, but she no longer felt the suffocating weight that had followed her every step since the night Miles was taken. Langford sat at table 7, a pale specter of the titan he had been minutes before. His mouth hung open slightly, his face slack with disbelief. He looked around for affirmation, for laughter, for the audience he thought he controlled, but no one met his eyes. The diners who once courted his favor were now riveted by the waitress he had tried to humiliate. The power he wielded so effortlessly at the start of the evening had slipped away, shattered in the wake of her music. The silence deepened, stretching until it became unbearable. Then, a single sound cut through from the back of the room. Clap. The sharpness rang like a gunshot in the charged air. Every head turned. Gabriel Duval, the white-haired critic, was on his feet. His expression was not casual approval, but something more profound, close to reverence. He clapped again, slow and deliberate. Clap, clap, clap. The sound rolled through the hall, a verdict pronounced with authority. The spell broke. A woman in the front row began to clap, tears streaming down her cheeks. A ripple moved through the diners, growing louder, faster, until the entire restaurant erupted. Chairs scraped back, glasses shook, chandeliers trembled as the roar of a standing ovation filled the Gilded Swan. People shouted brava, wept openly, and clapped until their hands burned. Aria sat motionless at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of sound crashing over her. She had silenced them with her music, and now they were giving her voice back, 100-fold. Across the room, Ben Carter, her fellow server, pumped his fist into the air, tears shining on his face. Mr. Harris stood by the kitchen door, his expression a mixture of awe, pride, and disbelief. Even the other staff members, who had lived invisible lives beside her, he was still seated, still silent, still crushed beneath the magnitude of what had transpired. She looked at him without anger, without triumph. There was only pity, quiet and devastating. The man who had wielded wealth and arrogance as weapons had been rendered small, insignificant, forgotten in the shadow of a waitress who had played her truth. Gabriel Duval's eyes met hers across, and though she was exhausted and trembled from the effort, a small smile broke through her tears. She had come to the piano to endure humiliation, but she had found instead resurrection. The final chord might have faded into silence. But its echo lived on in the people who stood before her. In the critic, he had built his life on control, on the ability to bend rooms and people to his will, with the weight of his fortune. Tonight, he had expected nothing more than a cruel